This podcast is a part of the Garnett Media Group podcast network. Garnett Media Group is the official partnership between student-run media outlets at the University of South Carolina. For more information on GMG podcasts or other student work, visit garnettmedia.org. Hi, my name is Dr. Jabari Evans, and welcome to Uncommon Naledge, the podcast where we talk about all things spanning race and representation within mass media. This podcast is a partnership between the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of South Carolina and Garnett Media Group. So without further ado, let's get into this week's episode. All right. So, Chelsea, it's so good to see you, man. I was just talking to my wife about the time we spent in Paris for ICA and how it felt like almost like a reunion of sorts, where a lot of the Northwestern people who are on the tree but aren't any longer on campus in Evanston were sort of able to sort of get together and network and chop it up. And it's really interesting to see how people talked about doing certain things maybe first or second year, and to see how that stuff actually comes into fruition in many different ways, or even how some of those things change over time in terms of how people talk about how their ideas are going to take shape. I was talking to her about just our conversations about you coming in from New York and doing work at CBS, and how that was gonna translate sort of into your experiences at Northwestern. Do you feel at this point that you've kind of found your research direction for your agenda?
Yes and no.
Okay.
I think in part, I think I have been able to more clearly clarify the things that I am really interested and passionate about pursuing. Because when I came into Northwestern, I was coming from a journalism space, and I thought I just wanted to study I thought I wanted to do political communication. How does news talk about politics and left and right and bias, which is still really interesting to me, but I think I don't know if that's where my passion was at the intersection of communications and journalism and people and information. So I think to a certain degree, I have definitely been able to clarify the spaces I like to take up, kind of the areas I'm interested in. But I do think there's a lot of breadth to the work that I do.
Right.
I like to leave myself open. So a lot of my work, I like to say falls into buckets like journalism and information, critical technology, infrastructure studies, and then, kind of Black feminism and critical race theory is organizing theories, especially when thinking about people and populations and usage. But if it some way touches on 1, 2, 2.5, 3 of those buckets, I will pursue it, which I think sometimes makes parts of my work look a little disparate from each other. But I think I can see the through line, even if I think it's broader than I think what some other people may do.
Well, besides just being at Northwestern and being at MTS, which is so interdisciplinary in and of itself, I felt that experience leaves you at times siloed, where you're in your spaces with your advisor and you're sort of left to your own devices. And then you kind of come together during brown bag talks and things of that nature, where you kind of, oh, that's what so-and-so does. But you don't often get a window into what people are doing as they're doing it. I think the fact that you worked with AJ, who was on my committee and actually was one of the primary reasons that I went to Northwestern, is why I think I took a great interest into, learning more about your work and hearing about how your research was sort of developing, and even how your work with AJ was sort of developing. How do you think maybe his perspective, because he's someone who I look at as being, I don't want to say, I guess, is radical a proper term, but like, because I hear people tell me often that it's hard to be in academia and be radical. But if there's one person that's, I feel like, sort of takes rules and if doesn't, and kind of breaks them and makes them his
Mm-hmm.
own, I feel like he's one of those people. And in many ways, I could find that energy is inspiring. How do you think you working with AJ sort of helped you not only to develop your identity in academia, but how do you think sort of being around him and the work that he was doing with or still is doing with OTV sort of gave you the courage to sort of take these newer turns into your work?
Yeah, well, yeah, if you're not going to use radical, I think at least like non-traditional for an
Fair.
academic
Right.
is like a fair way to describe the work he does, the kind of work he does. Um, and I think he pursues it because he's passionate about it. It's the kind of
Hmm.
work that he wants to do. It can be riskier
Yeah.
in the setting that we are in, right? Because
Hmm.
if it doesn't look like what people are used to,
Right.
then they'll be like, well, what is the value or how do I assess this for tenure and promotion? So,
Right.
but what I really did appreciate about working with AJ was I think he really gave me a lot of freedom and space
Mm.
to do that, like passion finding, passion following. So, like, one of the kind of first big projects that I did on my own and is still kind of a key part of my work. It was my first kind of solo authored paper that I published,
Right.
was about how people are using kind of Black feminist practices in journalism. And a lot of the time it's
Hmm.
Black women and femme and queer folk when they're
Yeah.
making their own independent podcasts, news outlets, right? And they're
Mhm.
actively operationalizing kind of Black feminist ideas when they're reporting on thinking about news. And I feel like the way that I kind of came to that was I had been kind of doing like a little bit more, again, that like political communication, bias in media
Mhm.
studies. But personally, I really loved listening to like Black culture podcasts and like Black news
Mhm.
podcasts. And had been taking theory courses in Black studies and very much thinking about critical race theory, Black feminism. And I'm hearing so many of the ideas and concepts and praxis that we're thinking about in these like very academic settings, like
Mhm.
coming out in these very accessible, casual ways in these different podcasts in different ways, right? They're not all the
Right.
same, but like it's being mirrored, and a lot part of it is because it's the lived experience of the people who are talking, right? And it's part of
Mm.
it's the lens that they're using. And I said, this seems interesting to me. I feel
Mhm.
like there's something to be explored here. And I remember I just like called AJ and I was like, I have, because we had a meeting, a check-in meeting, but it was a call. And I
Right.
said, I have this idea. I'm noticing these things. This could be something to explore. And he said, sure.
Have at it.
It was like, sure, why not? Yeah, think about it, come up with some research questions and think about how you would go about this. And I think that got me started. But I think it was really that, like, he really gave me the space to explore what I wanted my research to look like and how I wanted it to look like. And even when I was helping him with the work with OTV, right? The kind of real kind of impact of work that is academic in the sense that you are in the academy and that's how you're being assessed, but also like community focused, community driven. Um, that's really not like, I'm just going to write this paper, but thinking about making some sort of lasting contribution that is of value to a community in some way. And I think that is really important to him. And I think became really important to me in a way that it probably I wasn't even thinking about when I entered grad school. So I think, yeah, I think that's kind of the ways that I think having him as an advisor specifically has really influenced
Mhm.
that. And I don't know if I would have gotten that if I had someone else as an advisor.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think on the one hand, like there's been I don't know what you would call it, like an interest that's been taken by a lot of universities to at least in some way have at least one person on faculty that's engaging in research that centers on marginalized communities. But I think in certain instances, I'm seeing um, that there are academic communities at specific institutions, and I think Northwestern is likely one of those, where I'm seeing individuals who are really kind of bringing nuance to that work and thinking
Mm-hmm.
about like intersectionality, and I know your work sort of engages a lot with like Black digital feminism. I recently had
Mm-hmm.
Catherine Knight Steele on the podcast, and we talked
Mm-hmm.
about that. But you also look at like, femme identities, queer folks, and how
Mm-hmm.
they're engaging in sort of these information seeking practices. And so, besides the fact that we know that like Black queer folks are powerful producers of media, like what have you sort of learned in your work about how like either young or young adults in that community are seeking out information in terms of their identities and their community and the things that matter to them that pertain to those identities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's some of the work that I'm doing and exploring now, especially when
Hmm.
it comes to like younger people. But I do think that if we're talking about like younger Black, femme,
Hmm.
queer folks, right? I think the digital space, and I, love Catherine Knight Steele's work. I draw on it quite a bit, right? When I'm thinking about these things, is that they're really using this as like it's a space of information, but it's also like a space of connection too. I
Mm.
think they are, and all the work I've done, I think Black women, femme folks online are very aware that these spaces are not necessarily made for them,
Right.
that these spaces can open them up to harm, that these spaces can open them up to surveillance.
Hmm.
Um, but none of those things are necessarily going to stop their practices, right? Their practices are really about how do we continue to educate, inform, find information, put out information,
Hmm.
build community around and in spite of all of these things, right?
Mm.
Um,
That's
and
real.
so
That's real.
yeah, it's like there's an understanding this technology was not necessarily made for you.
Yep.
The people who are making this technology don't necessarily care about you or your
Mm.
community or your well-being.
Mm.
Um, but that is not going to stop them
Mm.
from using these tools, right, to teach people things. I think
Right.
um part of this is from research, but part of this is just like an observation. I think that young people today, I feel like they seem so much smarter than I was at that age, right? They really like have this incredible knowledge base that they really want to share with people. They want to push these narratives and these boundaries,
Hmm.
and they're very willing to do it even if there is some sort of expense to them, or they know that there is a risk in that. So it is really interesting to explore and watch now. And especially TikTok is becoming I'm doing a study
Mm.
right now on Black women and femme folks using digital tools for information seeking,
Hmm.
and still collecting data. So have no kind of arguments or clear, tangible thing. But like that whole the search is shifting to TikTok thing from
Hmm.
preliminary data seems to be very real.
It is.
With the
Yeah.
younger kids, yeah.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
something about the way in which they can find information there as part of a community that seems super important.
Mm.
And again, very early stages, so don't feel comfortable like saying what it is, but there's
Oh no.
something, yeah, there for sure.
I know how that goes. When it's
Yeah.
half baked, it's like,
Mhm.
nah, it's not edible yet.
Yes, I don't have
But
any clear arguments or analysis, but I'm looking at the early data and I'm like, okay, there's something to be explored.
that's real. I mean,
Yeah.
the fact that I'm in now a school of journalism, I think has helped me to think in ways where I can look at the practice of producing media as well as like I can think a little bit about my own experiences making music or whatever, even doing this podcast where it's perceived as scholarship. It's perceived in a way that I don't know it would be perceived if I was strictly just in a school of media studies or if I was in school of mass communications, because most of our department uh, are either active journalists or they're people who, spent a majority of their career as journalists. Um, in terms of like a platform like TikTok, I've been sort of theorizing around half baked again, this idea of like citizens journalism through
Mm-hmm.
platforms like TikTok and YouTube and Instagram. And I'm wondering what it is that maybe you've seen in your work about intersectionality that might lend itself to some type of framing for how that sort of plays out for creating like, I guess, counter voice to these big machines. You've been a part of the mainstream level of that type of work. Like, what do you
Yeah.
see in terms of like that intersectional perspective that sort of in this DIY sort of space? Um, how, I guess, is their production process differing or in any ways radical than sort of what you did even at CBS?
I mean, I think it's you just don't have as many when we're thinking about like citizen journalism on
Mm-hmm.
TikTok, or we're just thinking about people who are doing independent journalism, which is a little different than citizen journalism.
Right.
But when you're not working within an institution,
Mm-hmm.
you are not bound to the limits that that institution sets on you.
Mm.
And the limits that that institution sets on you, I found through my own experience, and I think a lot of people will tell you this, there's been though their motives are one, a lot of the time business bottom line driven, right?
Of course. Of
And they
course.
very much lean towards the maintenance of some kind of status quo, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think when you are freed from those bounds, either because you go out and you decide to do kind of independent journalism, start your own news outlet, or you just decide to start your own TikTok news channel or
Mm-hmm.
blog news channel, right? You can really expand the way in which you think and talk about news or what you
Mm-hmm.
define as news or a news event. And so if we're specifically thinking then about like, what can a Black feminist praxis bring to it? Well, it can bring those other ways of talking about news and information, right? What are you picking up on? Who are you centering? Whose voices are you centering? What elements of an event are you thinking about that like are not just like here are the basic facts, but like are you digging deeper to think like here are how specific communities are going to be impacted.
Mm-hmm.
And I did a little bit of work talking to citizen journalists on TikTok. And there, for this like work, there wasn't a specific, Black feminist framing, right? But there
Right.
were, I think one reason that some people got into this was because they were like, I think that it is important sometimes to give a different perspective on what is going on and specifically make it accessible for communities that may feel news is not accessible for them, that feel like
Mm-hmm.
the New York Times, right? And I don't mean accessible in the fact that they can't get it or read it, right? But that it just
Mm-hmm.
doesn't relate to the things they care about or this perspective that they're talking or the lens that they're talking about it with. They're like, that doesn't apply to what I need to know about this.
Mm.
And so, I think that TikTok especially has become a really interesting space where whether they're coding it as citizen journalism or not,
Mm-hmm.
like Black women and femme and queer folks are taking it as a space to really talk back to these mainstream narratives, very
Mm-hmm.
similar to what I think was happening on Twitter and in Black Twitter, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or Black feminist Twitter.
Right.
Um, but now I think it's also taken a younger turn, right? Because I think a lot of
Mm.
people too who were very core to Black Twitter, and as a sub to that, like Black feminist Twitter, at least a lot of people I spoke to, like they were a little, they were kind of a, what is it, Gen X, who's above
Yeah,
millennial.
or yeah, probably millennial,
Yeah,
Yeah.
like older millennials, right? Older millennials. And the people that I'm seeing on TikTok, they're like, 19, 20, 21 now, right? And so they're creating very similar kind of dynamics and communities where they're, again, like talking back to these mainstream narratives, but they're in a different space now. They're on
Yep.
TikTok. And because they're on
Yep.
TikTok, they're doing it in different and new and creative ways that may have music or dances and
Yes.
as well. But I think that's what it lends, it's not wholly different from other things that we've seen, but the demographic, the community demographic, they're getting a bit younger too, and they're speaking their language.
It's amazing because I sometimes I wish that Black folk didn't like have generational separatism at times, because like
Mhm.
I think we could learn so much from one another instead of being dismissive of how people are kind of moving about how they want to experience and
Mhm.
communicate themselves. But like I say all that because like I was at the Black Twitter Summit when it was at CUNY in New
Mhm.
York, and it was it was put together by Meredith Clark, whose work I love, and as well as
Mhm.
Andre Brock and a few other people.
Mhm.
And it was great to talk about old times, talk about how we first got on Twitter and how like we found community and connectivity and those things. But the other part of it is like the conversation kept going towards like how can we keep Black Twitter as a thing now that Elon is taking over and it's X and it's this and it's that. And the greatest thing that happened to me during that whole like conference or summit was that there was an undergraduate who was in the room who was like, we don't even use Twitter anymore.
Yeah.
Like,
They've left.
and it was I laughed, but it was funny because I was like, yeah, my son's 16 and he's kind of like, why are you guys are having an
Mhm.
entire conference about a platform that's dead. Like, why are we why are we there? But it was interesting to see that there was a room full of people, scholars as well as those who like participated as like
Mhm.
influencers on the platform. I think they were just mourning a level of nostalgia
Mhm.
versus, being open, because there were a lot of academics who found audiences through Twitter as well.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of them just felt like they didn't have a home, or that they didn't feel comfortable clinging on to their engagement on a platform that they didn't feel comfortable with who was running
Mhm.
it. And me, I'm just sitting there like, yeah, I found Twitter through music, and I used to try to promote myself for my music, and I found
Mhm.
Twitter as a great way to sort of talk to fans directly, talk to
Mhm.
folks who were in certain places. Like if I was traveling on a tour and I saw somebody owned a sneaker boutique, I could communicate with them directly that I was going to be in their
Mhm.
town or whatever, direct messaging, things like
Mhm.
that, right? So it had utility, but I'm like, what this young person was trying to tell the room is that we don't necessarily have to mourn Twitter being gone. We can look at like the new opportunities and the new platforms that are being created, and like we can kind of learn from the mistakes of how we didn't kind of take ownership in any way of Twitter or the business of Twitter, and we kind of gave our data to this platform, and maybe we can create new opportunities for ourselves, because Black folks are always going to create stuff, right? We're always going to
Yeah.
talk about things, and we're always going to commune. But this younger generation, like you said, is far more visual, far more multimodal, far more
Mhm.
like, I don't just want to read and write. I want to tape a video. I want to do that. It's a little bit more
Yeah.
interactive and it's more dynamic, but that doesn't mean we have to poo poo TikTok, right? Like, oh, you're a TikTok scholar. Like, I'm a Twitter scholar. It's just, I don't know. It's an interesting.
Yeah, and
uh,
why do you have to be one or the other? I don't think I think the I think that when I think about social media platforms, and I think a lot of people do too, right? It's not so much like, well, Twitter's over here and TikTok's over here and
It's all,
Meta's over
yeah,
here, right? Because
right.
I think from the perspective that I tend to come from, it's like, why are the people coming here? And what are the
Mm,
people doing? And I think
mm,
at the root of that, a lot of the impetus seems to be the same. I want to build community. I want to share my perspective, my story. I want a
right.
platform for, my tell my story, my lived experience.
Mhm,
It's similar. It's just the tools that we're using to do it are different, right? Or
right.
what's afforded to us in one place is a little different than what's afforded to us in another place. But yeah, but I still think that that core idea is still very similar. And so yeah, it's maybe like, I'm not on Twitter, my Annie was on Twitter, but but like, you may be going to TikTok for the same reasons that she went to Twitter,
There you
you
go.
know?
There you go. A party is cool until what? Until your mom shows up,
Yeah.
and then it's no longer the cool party.
Uh-huh. I mean, yeah, yeah.
But if you go through those photo albums of the 70s, at least when I've done that, I'm like, Mom, my mom was kicking it. So at the same time, I think there's stuff that we could learn to at least further, these movements, because I think these movements, again, have shown up and shown up time and time again. And I think, you know, Craig Watkins, he talks about this idea that we're always power users of media, but we're not powerful users of media. And I'm like, oh, I'm
Yeah.
like, I'm like, Dag, I
Well,
never thought about it like that. So we show up to places, make it cool, they gentrify it, and then lock us out of the money making or even just the joy making of the thing. Like they
the
structure
joy
it or
making.
architect it. Yeah, that the
That's the part too, I feel like is important, because it's like, Black people, Black culture can make a place cool
yes.
and people want to come, but then they don't necessarily want to respect the Black people or the culture in that space anymore.
It's
So then you get,
amazing.
because the experience is different, because now it's not a fun, joyful experience,
Mm,
because it feels like if I constantly have to be on the defensive,
yeah.
then I can't just have fun with it. And you can still have fun with it, but
Mm,
it's different when you're like looking over your shoulder at the same time, you know?
yeah. Yeah, I was playing around one time and just I was talking to a couple of colleagues and I was just saying like resistance sometimes feels carceral, right? It's like it's the thing that I think often drives the funding for certain types of work. I think it's a word that has existed forever, so we just lean on it as oh,
Mm-hmm.
that's resistance and the resistance and oh, you showed great resilience and resistance.
Resistance and resilience. Yeah.
And I guess I just wonder if, and this is just an open-ended question, if you think at all like the reliance of Black studies often, especially Black digital studies, on the idea that these young people are resisting something, whether that is sort of stifling the potentialities for this work, as well as the reasons why maybe some folks who are outside of the canon are unwilling to sort of accept this work into certain
Mm-hmm.
mainstream spaces, particularly in the communications discipline. What do you think about that? This is very loaded and open ended, but I wondered what you might have thought about that.
Yeah, it is. And it's something that I've thought about quite a bit recently
Hmm.
in my work, because I feel like on the one end, there's like everything is resistance and resilience against trauma.
Yeah.
And you run the risk of reducing our experiences to just resistance and resilience against trauma, like the
Hmm.
trauma of white supremacy, the
Right.
trauma of racism, sexism, misogynoir is always dictating the way we're responding in our
Mm.
experiences. I think at the other end, like, there have been arguments about just focusing on the joyful parts, but maybe to the like exclusion or the almost wanting to not recognize that there are people who still need to live and survive, and there is
two
resistance,
extremes, basically. There's two extremes.
And I think that realistically, I think we have to make space for both. And I think going too far to one end on either side, I think, can be detrimental. Like, I don't want to, when I'm talking to people about their experiences, why they're going online, I don't want it to wholly be about like they had to fight back constantly, you know, because I think it is reductive, and it is taking out the parts where people came here to have fun, you know, like people came here to be creative. But I do think that if we're like, oh, we're only going to focus on like the fun things, like there are people who are out there who are actually trying to survive. And if we're thinking about the way that people are especially using technology, and we're not thinking about that to some extent, then that can, you know, it can also be problematic in a way. So I think in my work, I am constantly also trying to think about, okay, well, how do I keep space for both realistic? Because I think both is what all of our experiences are, right? I think, you know, we deal with hard things. We live in a society that, you know, where we are systemically discriminated against in various many ways, overlapping, but also like we have fun. And we have joy in culture. And we have joy in community. And like, those are important, just as important. And so I think that, I don't know if this quite answered your question, but I think that's where I am trying to be more intentional in landing in my work. In how do I, in my work, always recognize the things that are hard and resistant, but also keep space for, this is also about joy. And this is also about somebody pursuing that joy or wanting to find a community to find that joy. Because it is hard to constantly, like, not, you know, no knock on like Afro pessimism, but it does feel very defeating. Because I remember when I was in grad school, and I would take Black Studies classes. And I am not in the politics of the department at all, which I think was helpful, being an outsider coming in. But it definitely felt like there was groups of people who were like deep into Afro pessimism. And they would always be like, they'd go on and then they'd be like, and this is all Black death. And then you see the other half of the Black Studies majors go, here we go again, you know, because I think the tension that was being expressed was like, why do we always have to land on trauma and death? You know, like, not to say that that's the totality of what Afro-pessimism is, and I don't want to act like I'm just glossing over it, but I think that the sighs that I was hearing from the other half of the room were like, where do we find the space to talk about the joy and the thriving and all of those other things? And I, as somebody who is not a Black Studies grad student, could just be like, interesting dynamics.
Right.
I'm not in it. You guys have to take classes together and be in the same cohort. I'm just popping in from
That's how I felt in undergrad. That's how I felt in undergrad, when everybody was like running to, you know, Afro-American studies as a major, or AFAM as we affectionately called it. I was like, I could do this as a minor, or like I could show up here and take the interesting classes with the professors that I want to take them with. But some of these conversations just get too, it almost felt like talking about religion, where like, but the thing is, now on the other side, I guess, of seeing academia from the perspective of a scholar, I recognize too that the longer you're in it, if you planted your flag somewhere, you need someone to cite your work. And so it becomes a thing where you tell your entire tree that it doesn't matter what you write, you got to cite these people and these ideas before you
Mm-hmm.
start talking about your idea. And I think the folks who sit on the, as Jim Webster used to call it, the happy pile, uh, they have, you have a book of people who are upset, a book where people are optimistic, and then there's a pile of them, and they go from one side to the other. And I think those who are in the happy pile have less notoriety,
Mm-hmm.
less, they've been cited less, maybe especially in the bigger, more widespread top rated journals. That work tends to get, rejected or marginalized into
Mm-hmm.
spaces where it's in a lesser journal, or even it has to get in some type of special edition invite situation. um I think people feel like they got to stand on it if that's the work they've been doing for the last 20 to 30
Mm-hmm.
years. But these newer, younger scholars are like, hey, what if I just write a paper and never cite any of that? And so I think there's also
Yeah.
some adversarial stuff there that's going on, not just within Black studies, but within, I think, a lot of disciplines where
Mm-hmm.
the work of, like, I see this in sociology because I step in those spaces a little bit more often, where, like, because of accessibility, often exploring poverty and exploring, like, poor Black and brown folks becomes like the least path of resistance to complete the dissertation, to do your work. And so then it becomes like less about understanding maybe the harm that it does to not think about joy, but it becomes like the easiest thing to do because
Mm-hmm.
there's such a large breadth of work that's there that already does that. So instead of having to, like, propose this new idea, oh, I'm just adding on to a canon that
Mm-hmm.
already exists. I mean,
Yeah,
clearly
and
you
there's also
you haven't had to, like, deal with too much pushback from your advisor, right? You had an advisor that
yeah.
was very, like, positive towards the stuff you do, but have you encountered at all any pushback in academia in terms of, like, some of the choices and decisions you might be making in your agenda?
I have not,
Hmm.
but I think that, well, one, again, as you said, I had an advisor that was pretty open to most of my half-baked ideas. And I think let me run with them, which I think in retrospect was extremely advantageous for me too
Mm,
when I was looking for a job,
yeah.
because I do remember that one of the first, or if maybe even the first job talk that I went on, which was kind of very early in the fall of that year that I was looking for a job, in one of my faculty interviews, or maybe it was even the interview with the committee, somebody said to me, one of the biggest things we look for and that you don't always see is somebody whose work is like their own and distinct from their advisors.
Okay.
Because sometimes they're like, you just did everything your advisor told you to do, but then
Mm,
when you get here and you have to be a faculty on your own, how do we know that you can come up with your own ideas and your own
yeah.
agenda without somebody being like, you have to do what I'm doing? Exactly. So no, and then I think now I find myself also in a very, interdisciplinary
Yeah.
space, which I think again lends itself to me kind of, exploring things.
Hmm.
I'm in an information school. We have people from all different types of academic backgrounds. We
Yeah.
have computer scientists and engineers, we have economists, we have other people who come from more communications studies like backgrounds,
Hmm.
anthropology, obviously
Yeah.
library and archives research, which is what information schools, first came out of. And so
Hmm.
a lot of HCI researchers. It doesn't feel like I always have to slot myself into a specific bucket.
That's right.
And we, in our information school, we actually don't have departments,
Mm.
which I think has been very advantageous for me personally, because
Hmm.
then I don't feel like I'm beholden to a specific department or research area. Like I'm going to do
Hmm.
this information seeking type research. I'm also going to be presenting over here about technology and Afrofuturism. and
Right.
Black women's work. And I'm also going to be over here like talking about like Black feminist news and kind
I
of
ain't mad at that.
and they're like, well, as long as like the journals seem reputable and
There you
the
go.
publishers seem reputable, which is another thing, but like they're like, but if you could get that work in those spaces, then we'll take it on its merit. So I think that has been a very fortunate part of my journey, that I have been in two spaces where I really have been, obviously with some of its disciplinary limits. Like I can't go over here and be like, I'm going to, do this whole completely different. Well, I don't know. Maybe I could if I could make a good argument.
They say after you get tenure, you can do whatever you want, but I don't know what that feels like yet.
Yeah,
But
neither. You're closer than I am, so I have no idea.
they say, but I don't know. I don't know that to be true.
Yeah. And I mean, it's definitely not the safest path necessarily, right? Because you do have people who are like, you need like a clear, cohesive narrative, and you need to like, it all needs to be in one structure, and you kind of need to put bounds on your work. But recently, kind of as an encouraging of me continuing to follow my bliss when it comes to research, we have, I believe the fellowship is by our anti-racist research kind of collective that we have here at the University of Michigan. They started a new faculty fellowship. And this, I believe it's inaugural. I don't know 100%, but this year's recipient was Dr. Whitney Pirtle. And she came and talked about her career trajectory. And she's like, I'm also the type of person who has a lot of different pots and buckets. And I think similarly, she has a through line and a grounding in like critical race theory, in the various types of work that she does. But she's like, it is, she's one of those people like it is possible to be interested in different things that are connected by a through line, but not necessarily the same, and get tenure.
That's real.
Yeah. And
That's
I think a lot
real.
of us had questions about that, because I think a lot of people are, we don't always just have one singular research interests. We have various interests that are like connected by some type of theory or some type of value or driving, community need. But that doesn't mean all that research is going to look exactly the same.
Very true. Very true. Particularly like I've seen now more than ever students come out with a dissertation that appears to frame them as one thing, and then be like, nah, I'm done with that. I'm gonna go over here and do this whole other thing. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think traditionally that was like taboo, to like not pick something that you're gonna stick with, or that, this is your puzzle, and for the next 15 years you're gonna be trying to tackle this thing. And it's just, particularly in a space like communication or thinking about media or even information, the landscape is changing at such a rapid rate to where you're going to find things you're interested in every 3 months. And it's just kind of hard. It's kind of hard to not want to, in some ways sort of take the lead and explore some things as they're happening, versus waiting and doing it at the perfect time, as people sometimes sort of pitch to you. One of the things I wanted to ask you is just, and then we're almost at time, but this is one of the I have two questions, but this was one question I really wanted to ask you, is like, having been on the side of a creator and a producer, I'm not sure if you had any dreams of going back into that space, but how do you see and view industry now that you're sort of in this academic space and sort of, I guess, less no, institutionalized, just in a different way, but like how do you kind of view the profession now? Do you still interact with folks that are kind of in that lane or in that world, and could you ever see yourself back in that space? And what do you think you would bring to that type of role now that you've done all this education, you've done all this research? How would you then be in a newsroom today as Chelsea?
Yeah, I I don't know if at this point I could say that I would go back.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I definitely had some great experiences and learned a lot doing it.
Uh-huh.
Um, I I don't know and I think that's part of the reason I left it. Well, one, it's like,
Okay.
especially if we're talking about news and journalism, right? It's
Right. Mm-hmm.
very, fast paced, not a lot of break. Like it's a very intense sort of career.
Yeah.
And I think academia is intense too in its own ways, but
Mm-hmm.
I get a lot of control over that intensity in terms of scheduling, in
Yeah.
terms of how I am getting all of this work done. You don't get those same freedoms. Like sometimes you just have to be there for 48 hours and it is what it is. And,
Mm-hmm.
whatever else is in your life, has to take a back seat.
Yeah.
But I also think that, again, being in an institution that is setting kind of the trajectory of kind of the kind of work you're doing, the values of the work that you're doing, it didn't always align with what I felt like I wanted to be doing or what I felt would be kind of the best use of the work that I could do.
Okay.
Um, in terms of like the potential impact I wanted to have, or maybe more like the kinds of impact that I
Right.
wanted to have.
Mm-hmm.
And I still have a lot of friends who do really great work still in newsrooms and
Right.
great reporting work. And I look at the stuff that they do, and I do think that it is important. But I just don't know if that is for me in that way. If
Mm-hmm.
that's
Mm-hmm.
if that makes sense. I
Fair
think if
enough.
I were to go back into that space, it would have to be like in a very autonomous role, like a
Mm.
consulting role,
Okay.
or even like I am creating my own thing and my own space,
Right.
either on my own or with collaborators who I feel like are completely aligned with the kind of work that I would want to put out.
Right.
But I don't know if I would like to go back where somebody else is telling me, well, these are the things we need to care about, and these are the
Mm.
stories that we need to care about, or
Right.
this is the way we need to frame the stories that we care about.
Mm.
Uh, I I just don't. Some of it was great and some of it didn't feel great.
Of course.
And I just don't know if now that I have the option, I need to necessarily do that again in that same way. Because again, I was just an associate producer on the payroll.
Mm-hmm.
um, so I would, if I was to go back, it'd have to be in a way that had a lot more autonomy to
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
No, journalism is not for the weak or weary.
No.
Like I know originally I before doing any of the things that I've done in my life, I came into undergrad wanting to be a sports journalist, and that was sort of, what I was cutting my teeth to sort of do, and I was seeing what individuals who were like quote unquote mentors were doing in terms of moving around, like having disconnection from family, always just kind of
Hmm.
working and traveling. And they love their work and still love their work, but there were aspects to what I was looking at where I was like, oh, this is like you got to be selfish in these sorts of roles, but these roles are also very intense and
Yeah.
depending on your pathway and who kind of aligns themselves with you, that's going to sort of determine your fate. But I feel like that exists in a lot in our profession, even in academia. But um,
Hmm.
one of the things that you said kind of really struck me though is like I think when you land in the right role with the right collaborators, your voice is allowed to sort of flourish
Hmm.
in ways that it might not if you're even if you're in a great job but with the wrong collaborators.
Hmm. Yeah.
The money is not always worth the stress that comes along with it.
Yeah.
um, the last thing I wanted to ask you has to deal with like something I've been asking almost everybody who I've talked to over the last maybe 6 to 8 months. And that's sort of revisiting this idea of joy, but thinking about it more so from a personal perspective. We talk about media, we talk about music, we talk about television, all of these things,
Hmm.
right? But what are you actually consuming like in your personal life? Like what like do you just get joy from. It's not a work-related consumption. Like it could be a influencer that maybe you've just been stuck on lately, or a TV show, a podcast, so on and so forth, or maybe an artist that like has emerged in your playlist that you've just been obsessed with. What are you consuming right now?
Laughing because all of these feel embarrassing in some way, but in the best. So I do like some reality television.
I ain't mad at it.
The recent thing that is Love is Blind.
Okay. Okay.
I am so there's one.
Okay.
Watching a fair amount of Love is Blind. Do I have like my critical media lens on, or especially like Black women in media sometimes, but sometimes I'm like, this is just fun.
Yeah.
Like, you can't keep those thoughts out, but it's like, it's a mix of,
okay,
I don't know about this, but also there's something about this that makes me keep watching. I am actually a pretty big consumer of TikTok, I will say.
Okay.
I do get a lot of joy out of watching TikToks, not for research purposes, not because I'm doing a study on this thing. Like I have studied TikTok, I've written about TikTok, but I'm just talking about personal consumption, not for work, like seeing the content. I used to dance growing up, so I love all of the dance challenges and the different choreography that people come up with, like especially the one that the real dancers do.
Oh yeah.
It's really incredible. I'll go down rabbit holes for that. I also, because it's timely, I did watch the 50-part Who the F Did I Marry series on TikTok.
Oh, wow. You're going to send me down a rabbit hole.
Which isn't a joyful story in and of itself, but it is something that I was consuming for pleasure. And then I think, last but not least, maybe a bit of a cliche, I'm a huge Beyonce fan.
Okay, yeah. You and every woman I know.
I know, right? I'm like, none of this seems unique, but I am here for the country era.
Okay.
Also because she has now spotlighted the Black girls in country, have also started listening to Tanner Adele, who is a Black country artist, who also makes really fun country music. And I'm not the biggest country person, but there's no genre of music that I will ever discount, in the sense that even though I'm not the biggest country fan, like I like Dolly Parton, I've listened to the Chicks, so I've been listening to Tanner Adele alongside the new Beyonce stuff. So those are some of the things very recently that I've been consuming just for me, just for fun, and they're all great.
You gotta have that though. You gotta have that space where you could just consume. Literally 2 weeks ago, I interviewed Taylor Crumpton, and she's a journalist from Dallas, Texas, phenomenal writer. But like, she was actually talking about a tweet that she had, like, I don't know, maybe 2-3 years ago, where she's like, Beyonce is going to come back and she's going to reclaim country on behalf of Black Texans and Black rodeo culture. And I was just like, it's amazing how like those types of things spin back around. And she just wrote a piece for Time magazine, and I was like, wow, it's kind of interesting.
I've actually seen this.
Yeah, I was like, this is, I don't know, the world works in interesting ways, but that was one of those things where I was like, that's crazy that like something that you really just see as a fan could turn back around and enter into the professional space. But I'm here for it too. I think I'm here for the country era of, I think there's an educative piece too that's going on where I feel like, like you said, younger folks are now starting to get the understanding that like, oh wow, we did occupy that space. I forgot, I didn't really realize that was our thing. And if it takes Beyonce to do it, I'm here for it. Because
Yeah,
I'm
well,
from
that's what
Chicago. She did that with house music, and I'm from
yes,
Chicago, and I love house music. So I was like, I'm just happy more people can see the value in it, right? The messenger, I'm not so much worried about, but I'm like, oh, you see it now, okay, bet.
absolutely. I think a couple, I don't know if it was, I think I may have seen that tweet, but a couple people did guess that the act 2 was going to be country, in
Hmm.
part because, like, what I think a lot of people have said, that she seems to just be kind of reclaiming those genres that people like
Mm.
to seem to have forgotten that Black people started. Like, some people guess that the next one may be rock, because again,
Yeah,
it's like, we Black people were the foundation of all of these forms of artistry, and
tell
then somehow,
it.
as happens, get pushed out, and are not, then people just think it's, just a, white music genre thing. And I
Nah.
think it's reminding people, like, she was not the first, but she's reminding people, I'm also not going to be the last. Like, we have a stake and a space in this genre, in this music, that should be, respected and recognized on its own merit. And I think that's part of why people love it. I think that's part of why I love it. And so I think it's been great. Oh, and then one last thing on what I've been consuming, but also always consume, and I think it's because it reminded me, connect the Beyonce thing. I Again, none of these seem super original or unique to me, but I do love listening to the read. Like, that is my the
Mm.
I do, and I'm thinking about it because they just met Beyonce,
Yeah, yeah,
and the
yeah.
joy
Here we go.
that not only they got, but I feel like everyone who's been listening for so long and knows how much they love and supported Beyonce felt when we saw that they got to meet Beyonce. That
Hmm.
was also great. So yeah.
No, but my wife probably would have said two of those same instances if you were to ask her about, what gives her joy. She's
Mhm.
always turning her phone like, "Did you see that?" And I'm like, "Well, now I know." So I feel like I'm in the know in many
Yeah.
ways
Yeah.
due to the wonderful Black women that are in my life.
Mhm. Yeah, we keep you updated.
But Chelsea, this has been awesome.
Yeah.
You know, thank you for giving me your time. I know academics, we move on our own schedule, so sometimes it's hard to make those align, but I'm glad that you're thriving out there in Ann Arbor, that you're producing work that's valuable about communities that often aren't getting the visibility that they need. And so I think your work is going to take it's already taken a great turn, but I think it's going to have to take a real tremendous turn over the next year or two, as like the things that you're doing that are now half baked are going to come out of
Hmm.
the oven, and it's going to be really dope to see and have come to fruition. So I just appreciate you, and keep doing what you're doing. Don't let anybody tell you to stop, because you don't need to do
Thank you. I
that.
appreciate the encouragement, and thank you so much for inviting me on to chat. This has been really fun. It has.
Awesome, awesome.
Yeah.
That's another episode. Uncommon Knowledge. Dr. Jabari Evans. Peace. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, leave a rating or review. And to catch the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram at KnowledgeSense82 and on Twitter at KnowledgeSense82. Now that's different than how you normally would spell it. That's NALEDGE, Sense 82, as in 1982. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Peace.